Here I am again for my bi-weekly farm tour of Old Ford Farm. Today is July 7th and we're going to see big changes in the farm today. Lots of things have come and gone since the last time we were out here. Lots of things have grown really tall and there are lots of new things in the field. So I'm excited to walk you through, and we're just going to go ahead and get started. Each week we've been starting here in the carrot block, and the first thing planted in this carrot block is Celeriac, or celery root. And you can see that this has been recently weeded. When they come through and weed on this farm, because there's so much purslane, and because purslane is really good at replanting itself, just a leaf or a stem sitting on the ground, if it's wet, will replant itself. They weed into piles, and you can see some of the piles sitting here on the ground. So if it replants, it just replants in a pile, and if they get a rain, they can come through and pick these piles up and take these plants to the compost pile. Another thing I want to look at here is this newly rototilled section here, and this is going to be fall carrots, the big fall carrot planting in this section right here. Swiss chard continues to grow and continues to be harvested each week. We've looked at this before, but you can see on these plants the leaves that have been picked on the outside of the plant, and new leaves emerging from the center of each plant. Here's another newly rototilled bed that is likely to either be a cover crop or to be a fall planting of vegetables. And then in these next couple of sections, and we've been looking at this throughout the year, these are the rotation of beets, carrots, and cilantro and dill. And so last time we looked at this old planting of cilantro and dill, it's still here, but one of the things that you can see is that the cilantro is starting to make its seeds here, and these are coriander seeds. And I don't think it's intentional that it's been left here, but they just haven't gotten to it yet. The next section here, you can see, was just harvested, and these are carrots. And so the first group of carrots for the year has been pulled out of the ground. These were planted in early spring and just harvested in early July. There's another bed of carrots here, another bed that's newly tilled, and then another 3 beds that are a mix of carrots, cilantro and dill, and beets. In this one you can see the cilantro and dill here in the foreground, carrots behind it, and beets way down at the end. And in this next bed, I'm just going to try to get down here out of the wind a little bit. Here you can see beets in the front. And then in this next bed, you can see cilantro and dill that's ready to be picked, along with flowering galansoga. And this will be, I assume, picked for CSA harvest this week. In this next bed, you can see these beets have started to emerge. These were just coming out of the ground 2 weeks ago when I walked through. And not totally sure what's in here. This could be a planting of cilantro and dill, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And so we'll just wait and see next week what these little guys are. But you can get the sense of the succession throughout the season with older plantings, middle plantings, and then younger plantings, and that just continues. Cilantro and dill are planted every couple of weeks. Carrots and beets regularly, but not quite that often. And as we walk down here, You can see some of the younger plantings down here. This is a new planting of carrots, and carrots are direct seeded, and then they are weeded and thinned. And when I say thinned, I mean that you want the plants at a spacing that is close together, but not right on top of each other. And the spacing they use here is the width of about 2 fingers. So when they go through and weed and thin these, they thin them to a spacing that's about 2 fingers width. And you can see that's been done in this row, but not yet in this new planting where there are in many places bunches of plants right on top of each other. That's what happens when you direct seed. You're just dropping seeds into the ground, and you don't want big gaps in the field, and seeds for these kinds of crops are pretty cheap, direct seeded crops, so you overplant a little and then thin them out later in the season. The next block is the Cucurbit Block, and the last time that I was out here, these plants were under remay and they were very small. They've gotten big enough now that they can handle not being under the remay, which is there mainly to protect them from cucumber beetles. And when they get big enough, they can tolerate a little bit of cucumber beetle chewing. One thing I'm noticing here that's pretty interesting is you can see in this row how the plants on the end are smaller, and if you walk down you can see the difference between these plants is that the drip tape starts right here. So this plant and all of these other plants down the row are getting watered, whereas these smaller plants at the end are not. So even though we've had some good rains here, the difference between irrigation and no irrigation is really stark in this field. So this is winter squash all through here, and then melons, and a second planting of summer squash. Summer squash harvest has started, but these plants are just starting to make squash that are harvestable size. And this will continue to be planted throughout the season, and I'll show you in a minute the next place where the succession is going to go. This is a young planting of cucumbers. These are not starting to make cukes yet, but you can see the flowers on these, and you may be able to see there are definitely a number of bees working on these. I can also see, and we've been talking about this pest, the cucumber beetle, and I just saw one, but it flew away, so I don't think I'm going to be able to show you one right now, but they are small yellow beetles with black stripes on them, and they can really do a lot of damage on cucumbers and other crops. In this next section we have sweet corn, and you can see here the sweet corn that has just been planted. And look at the difference between the color of these plants and the color of the plants that are behind them. These are dark green, healthy plants, and the newly planted ones are just yellow. And there are two things that happen. One of them is they just run out of fertilizer in their seedling trays. As I've told you before, these are not direct seeded like corn often is, but transplanted into the field. So in the seedling tray they run out of fertilizer after a time. And they're also susceptible to transplant shock. When you put new plants in a field, they take a little while to adjust, and one of the things you see while they're adjusting is nutrient deficiencies. And down toward the end here you can see a planting that was planted sometime in the middle. It's a newer planting than the corn on the left, but not brand new like the corn that I'm walking through here. And you can see it's just starting to color up, especially at the tops of the plants where the new growth is. You still see some yellowing of the bottom leaves on that corn, but this corn looks really healthy. The next crop in here is watermelon. And this watermelon is starting to fruit. Not just starting to fruit, it's starting to mature. This is a pretty good sized watermelon right here. And here's another one here that's starting to size up. And so this looks like a good crop. A bunch of melons buried in here. You can start to see as I walk through. And then this older planting of summer squash, and it's not, the plants look beautiful, but it's no longer as productive as it once was, and so that's why they plant a succession of these through the season. Now, one of the pests that summer squash is particularly susceptible to is powdery mildew, and you can see that powdery color on the lower leaf of this plant right here. And powdery mildew is an interesting pathogen. It's a fungus, but unlike most fungi, it doesn't actually penetrate into the leaf. It sits on top and puts kind of like roots down into the top, through the top of the leaf. They're called haustoria, that penetrate into the cells and suck nutrients out. And so this patch isn't particularly infested, but I just wanted to point that pathogen out. There are powdery mildews that affect a lot of different crops, and they tend to be crop specific. So the powdery mildew that affects summer squash is different than the powdery mildew that affects peppers or lilac, but it is a newly emerging pest on many crops. There are lots of new powdery mildews that are coming along that are becoming very problematic. Here you can see a planting of kale, and this kale has been harvested throughout the season. With kale, when we come through and harvest, we're taking off the lower leaves, and you can see where that's been done on these plants right here. Oh, this is also interesting. All of these little black bugs sitting on the top of the, and maybe you can see them bounce when I shake this a little bit. Those are flea beetles. And that's one of the things that this, maybe the primary thing that this insect netting is protecting these plants from. Here we have a planting of leeks, and leeks are here in the cucurbit block, mainly because they're harvested at the end of the year like other cucurbits. Onions come out of the ground much earlier, and so they're not planted in the onion block. Now here you can see a newly rototilled part of the field, and I was told this week that this is going to be the final succession of summer squash and cucumbers and melons. You can see this planting of broccoli that much of it has already been harvested, and you can see where broccoli's been harvested there. But we may get some broccoli still out of here. I see a couple of places where there's still small heads on the plants. This is cabbage, and we have been getting cabbage in our CSA shares, but these are still sizing up. And then this big section here that has just been rototilled, you might remember that it was cover crop for a while and then it was mowed down. This is going to be the fall brassica planting. So all of the brassicas, the cabbage, the kale, the broccoli that is harvested in the fall will be planted in this section in the next couple of weeks, and so we can look forward to seeing that process. I just want to continue my weed tour a little bit. This is something that I've been doing in previous weeks. And this is one that isn't particularly common on this farm, but is a very common garden weed. And this is lamb's quarter. And you can see one of the things that's characteristic of lamb's quarter is it's kind of got this powdery white, you can maybe see that here, feature at the tips of the growing points. And that's actually kind of yeast that grows along with the lamb's quarter. Lamb's quarter, I think, is one of the best eating weeds. Some people call it wild spinach, and especially when it's young. This one's still okay, I think, especially these growing points of it. It's great to harvest and eat. And you can see there's some lamb's quarter plants in here. On many farms it's the dominant weed. On this farm it's not particularly common, but there is some. So here we move into the Nightshade Block, and you can see these tomatoes are flowering. There are actually little fruits now on the tomatoes, and they have been tied, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. So as they continue up, they continue to be tied up and supported so that they don't flop over onto the ground, which is what tomatoes would do if they weren't supported either by being tied or by being staked. And so you can see this big tomato block here, and in a second we'll see another tomato planting that's newer. Under here, this is eggplant. And eggplant is under insect netting because it's so susceptible to Colorado potato beetle. And I have a separate video in which I show you Colorado potato beetle on eggplant. Down at the end of this one row are some peppers, and next to it is a big block of peppers. These will also get tied up like the tomatoes, but they're not there yet, where once they start to develop heavy fruit, they'll need to be tied up. But as you can see, these peppers are really small still, not very mature. Incidentally, the difference between a green pepper and a red pepper is just maturity. Green peppers are just immature peppers, and they will all eventually turn red or yellow or brown if they're in the field long enough. It's one reason it's really important to get your peppers in and planted early. Here you can see the sweet potatoes, and wow, what a change. Sweet potatoes are vines, and you can see them actually vining into the peppers here. And when we first looked at these, they were just little sticks that were planted in the field. And now they're spreading out and forming a carpet across this whole section of field. Here's another tomato planting, and this one just went in. It's just been tied for the first time. Here you can see, and these are tomatoes that won't begin to produce mature fruit for probably another month. The next section here is basil, and this basil has been harvested once, and you can see the cut stems where it's been harvested from the top. Basil can actually be harvested multiple times. This planting here will grow back, and you can see part of it that hasn't been harvested down toward the end. And if we walk down a little bit further, behind it you can see a younger planting of basil. She does 2 plantings of basil here a year, and that basically gets her through the season. One of the things about basil that we always see is that it starts to flower, and if you can avoid that, it remains more flavorful and better, but they're totally edible with the flowers on. You can see the big pest on this basil here, and you can see the holes in the leaves is Japanese beetle, and you can see a number of them here mating with each other. Usually if you have Japanese beetle, you have Japanese beetle because you have grass. The grubs feed on the grass, but there are some. It's not as common a farm pest as it is a garden pest, because we often grow our gardens right next to our lawns. This is potatoes, and you can see these plants are not looking as healthy and happy as they were earlier in the season. The leaves are starting to curl up and brown a little bit, and that's because these potatoes are getting to the end of their life. The foliage has done its job. It has collected all of the sunlight that it can and converted it into sugar, and that sugar will be converted into starch, and the starch is primarily what makes up the potatoes that are now maturing underground. This is probably a few weeks away from its first harvest. The first harvest is usually the new potatoes, and many farmers wait until the plants have died back completely before they start harvesting potatoes. They'll probably get some potatoes out of the ground here in a couple of weeks. And this sad blank space here is a newly rototilled area that will get cover crop seed on it. That was, the last time we came through, peas. And you can also see the pea picking video that I did on the channel a little bit earlier in the year. Just a week or two ago I did that video. But peas are done. They have a relatively short season, somewhere between 2 or 3 weeks. They store pretty well, so there will be 3 CSA pickups this year with peas in the share. But they are done picking them for the year. Here you can see the garlic, and the garlic is really the plants anyway are starting to decline, because they're putting their energy now down into the garlic bulb at the base of the plant. They're using all of that photosynthetic energy that they accumulated through the year to store in their bulb at the bottom of the plant. Interesting, here you can see one of the scapes that was missed, and this will open up soon into a garlic flower. The next block is onions, and there are a couple of plantings of onions in here. On this farm they harvest green onions, which are just immature onions, and you can see this row here, a lot of the green onions have been harvested already. and there's still some to harvest down at the end. And then here you can see these onions are really starting to mature. And if you look down at the bottom here, you can see they're really sizing up and bulbing up. They will keep growing for a few more weeks and then they'll be harvested. This is a newer planting of onions. You can see these are not as mature. They're not quite as close to being harvested, but this planting is really getting close. This bed here was the first harvest of green beans, and I've talked about this in previous weeks, but in this farm you can see this succession planting of green beans where there's an older bed here, a little bit younger, a little bit younger, a little bit younger, a little bit younger, all the way down to green beans that have just emerged. And how long they continue to do this, I'm not sure, but we will have, with all these successions, green beans in the CSA share for a number of weeks during the summer. That's not easy to do. It takes a lot of work and a lot of planning to continually plant them out like that. And you can see the same thing with lettuce, where this mature lettuce will probably be harvested this week. This next batch the following week. This batch is a couple of weeks away. This one a few weeks away. And this final one here is just starting to emerge from the ground. These little tiny plants right here. And then finally you can see that they have rototilled in the oats and peas that we've been watching for the year, and they were first mowed and then just rototilled in. So all that nutrition that they've gathered, all that energy that they've spent gathering sugar through the year through photosynthesis has been incorporated into the field and will increase the organic matter in the field and the nutrition and be available for the next crop. So that's the end of the tour, and I will be back again in a couple of weeks, and I'll just end by looking at a few of these plants that are going to go into the field in the next few weeks. And this is lettuce. This looks like either Swiss chard or beets right here.